There's a fire most people don't understand. A kind of intensity that doesn't come from love, it comes from suppressed emotion. Avoidants don't love the way others do. They don't live in emotions, they store them. And when those emotions finally find a way out, they don't trickle, they explode. That's why their presence feels electric. That's why their touch feels different. That's why for a moment you feel like you found something rare, something powerful, something unforgettable. But here's the truth most people don't want to face. That intensity isn't connection, it's release. Avoidants are masters of control. They suppress vulnerability. They avoid emotional exposure. They build walls so high, even they forget what's behind them. But desire slips through the cracks. And when it does, it comes out raw, unfiltered, almost primal. That's why their passion feels deeper than love itself. Because for them, it's the only place they allow themselves to feel. But here's where everything changes. Most people get addicted to that intensity. They mistake it for emotional depth. They believe if it feels this strong, it must be real. But intensity without emotional safety is chaos. You're not experiencing closeness, you're experiencing contrast distance mixed with desire. And your mind, it gets hooked. Because humans don't chase consistency, they chase uncertainty with reward. One moment they're distant, next moment they're overwhelming. And that push-pull dynamic, it creates obsession, not love. That's why most people can't handle avoidance, because eventually the intensity fades and what's left is silence. No reassurance, no emotional availability, no depth beyond the surface. And suddenly you realize you weren't building something real. You were riding waves of emotional highs followed by emptiness. So here's the shift you need to make. Stop chasing intensity. Start valuing consistency. Stop being impressed by passion. Start asking for presence. Because real connection isn't loud. It isn't chaotic. It isn't confusing. It's stable. It's grounded. It's safe. And if someone can only give you intensity, but not emotional availability, then you're not experiencing love. You're experiencing a storm. And storms, they feel powerful, but they never stay. Avoidants don't lack emotion, they're overwhelmed by it. From the outside, they can seem calm, controlled, even detached, like nothing really gets to them. But that's an illusion built over years of conditioning. Somewhere along their journey, they learned that expressing emotions wasn't safe. Maybe it led to rejection, maybe it brought chaos, or maybe it simply wasn't received. So instead of feeling freely, they adapted. They started containing everything inside, locking it away behind control, discipline, and distance. But here's what most people don't realize. When you suppress emotion, it doesn't disappear. It builds, quietly, gradually, like pressure inside a sealed container. Every unspoken feeling, every ignored vulnerability, every moment they wanted to open up but chose not to, it all stacks up beneath the surface. And because avoidants are so good at functioning on the outside, no one sees the accumulation happening within. They become experts at distraction. They focus on work, goals, independence, routines, anything that keeps them from sitting still with what they feel. Emotional conversations feel heavy, uncomfortable, even threatening, so they avoid them. Vulnerability feels like a loss of control, so they resist it. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional bottleneck. They're feeling everything, but expressing nothing. An energy that isn't expressed emotionally doesn't just vanish, it finds another outlet. That's where intensity comes in. When avoidants enter moments of physical closeness, especially sexual connection, something shifts. The walls they've built don't disappear completely, but they loosen just enough. The structure of control weakens and all that. Stored emotional energy suddenly has a pathway. What they've been holding back for so long doesn't come out in words. It comes out in presence, in touch, in raw intensity. It's not calculated. It's not strategic. It's release. In those moments, they're not thinking about vulnerability the way they usually do. They're not analyzing, not pulling away, not protecting themselves in the same rigid way. Instead, they're finally letting something move through them that's been trapped for a long time. And because it's been building under pressure, it doesn't come out gently. It comes out powerfully, almost overwhelmingly. That's why their intensity feels different. It's not just physical, it carries emotional weight, even if they're not consciously aware of it. You can feel it in how present they suddenly become, how focused, how deeply engaged in that moment. It feels like connection, like depth, like something meaningful is happening beneath the surface. But what's really happening is that you're experiencing the overflow of everything they haven't expressed. And here's the part that confuses people. Outside of those moments, that same person can feel distant again, controlled again, hard to reach again. It's like a switch flipped on and then off. That contrast makes the intensity feel even more powerful because it's so different from how they normally show up. For the avoidant, this cycle can feel normal. They release, they reset, and then they go back to control. But for the person on the receiving end, it creates a question that's hard to answer. If they can feel this deeply here, why can't they show it everywhere else? The answer lies in where they feel safe letting go. Emotional expression requires vulnerability, and vulnerability still feels risky. Physical intensity, on the other hand, allows expression without the same perceived exposure. It becomes the only space where they unconsciously permit themselves to feel without fully confronting what those feelings
mean. So the intensity isn't fake.
It's real. But it's also limited. It's a fragment of everything they carry, not the full picture of who they are emotionally. And because it's only expressed in controlled bursts, it feels stronger than it would if it were integrated into everyday connection. What you're witnessing isn't emotional openness in the traditional sense. It's pressure finding a temporary escape. Sexual intensity can feel like the deepest form of connection two people can share. It's raw, immersive, and powerful enough to make everything else fade into the background. When you're in that moment with an avoidant, it can feel like you've finally reached them, like all their walls have come down and what's left is something real, something honest, something emotionally alive. But what feels like connection in that space is often something very different beneath the surface. Avoidants don't naturally process or express emotions in steady, open ways. Instead of talking through what they feel, they tend to internalize it, compress it, and push it aside so they can maintain control. Over time, that creates a buildup of emotional energy that has nowhere to go. It doesn't get resolved through conversation, it doesn't get softened through vulnerability, and it doesn't get released through emotional intimacy. It stays contained. So when a moment of physical closeness appears, especially one that feels safe enough and intense enough, that stored energy finally finds an exit. What you experience as passion is often that release in motion. It's not just attraction driving it, it's the sudden discharge of everything they've been holding in. That's why it feels so strong. Because it is strong. But strength doesn't automatically equal depth. Emotional connection is built slowly. It requires presence over time, honesty, consistency, and the willingness to be seen beyond controlled moments. It involves risk, the kind that comes with being understood, possibly rejected, or emotionally affected. Avoidants tend to struggle with that kind of exposure, so they don't engage with connection in that way for long periods. Sexual intensity, on the other hand, allows them to bypass those layers. It creates a space where they can feel without explaining, express without defining, and connect without fully opening. It's immediate and consuming, but also temporary and contained. Once the moment passes, so does the expression. This is where the confusion begins for the other person. You feel something real in that intensity, something that seems too powerful to be empty or surface level. It feels like meaning. It feels like truth. And naturally you assume that if someone can show up with that level of presence and passion, then they must be capable of emotional depth in other areas too. But intensity can exist without continuity. It can feel deep without actually being rooted. What you're experiencing is not necessarily a shared emotional bond growing between two people. It's often one person releasing internal pressure while the other interprets that release as connection. The signals feel aligned in the moment, but they don't always carry forward into consistent emotional availability afterward. That's why outside of those intense moments, the dynamic often shifts. The avoidant returns to distance, to control, to the patterns that keep them from feeling exposed. And for the other person, it creates a disconnect that's hard to reconcile. You've seen what they're capable of, you've felt something powerful with them, and now you're trying to understand why that same energy isn't present in everyday interaction. The answer lies in the nature of the expression. One is a release, spontaneous, uncontained, and momentary. The other requires intention, steady, vulnerable, and sustained. Avoidance may access the first without fully developing the second. That doesn't mean what you felt was fake. It means it wasn't the full picture. Intensity can mimic emotional closeness because it activates similar feelings: excitement, focus, immersion, even a sense of being chosen or seen. But without consistency and openness outside of those moments, it doesn't build into something stable. It remains an isolated experience rather than a growing connection. And that's why it can be so hard to let go of. You're not just remembering what happened, you're holding on to what it felt like it could become. There's something magnetic about intensity that pulls people in before they even realize what's happening. It doesn't ask for logic, it doesn't wait for clarity, it hits fast, it feels powerful. And it creates the illusion that something rare is unfolding right in front of you. When someone suddenly shows up with overwhelming passion, they are saying, I am so excited to be here. Deep focus and a kind of presence that feels almost consuming. Your mind doesn't question it, it labels it as love. Because most people have been conditioned to believe that love is supposed to feel intense, not calm, not steady, not predictable, but powerful, emotional, even a little chaotic. So when an avoidant expresses that burst of intensity, it checks every box your mind has been trained to recognize as something meaningful. The eye contact feels deeper. The energy feels different. The moment feels unforgettable. And without even realizing it, you start assigning value to it far beyond what's actually happening. You begin to think this must be special because I've never felt this before. And that's exactly where the trap begins. Humans are wired to chase what feels rare. Anything that stands out from the ordinary automatically feels more valuable. If something is easily available, consistent, and predictable, the brain slowly starts to normalize it. But when something is unpredictable, when it appears in bursts, when it disappears and then returns stronger, it creates contrast. And contrast amplifies perception. Avoidants naturally create that contrast. They're distant, controlled, emotionally reserved most of the time. So when they suddenly switch into a mode of intensity, it feels like a transformation. It feels like you've unlocked something hidden, something exclusive that not everyone gets to see. And that illusion of exclusivity makes the moment feel even more significant. You're not just experiencing intensity, you're experiencing it after absence. And that combination is dangerously powerful because your mind doesn't measure love by consistency in those moments. It measures it by impact, by how strongly it makes you feel, by how different it is from your normal experiences. So even if the connection lacks stability, your brain is already convinced that something extraordinary is happening. This is why people confuse intensity with love. Love in its real form is often quieter. It builds slowly. It shows up in consistent actions, in reliability, and emotional safety that doesn't fluctuate. But intensity doesn't need time to build. It arrives. Fully formed, hits hard, and leaves a lasting impression. And for someone who hasn't experienced stable emotional connection before, that intensity feels like depth. It feels like meaning. It feels like something worth holding on to. But intensity is not the same as emotional investment. Intensity can exist in a moment without extending beyond it. It can feel deep without being rooted in understanding, trust, or long-term presence. It can be powerful without being sustainable. And yet, because it feels so different from ordinary interactions, people elevate it. They start to believe that anything less intense must be less real. That calmness is boring. That consistency is predictable. That emotional safety somehow lacks passion. So they keep chasing that high. They keep looking for that same rush, that same overwhelming feeling, hoping it will eventually turn into something stable. But what they're really chasing is the emotional spike, not the connection itself. Avoidants don't necessarily intend to create this illusion. It's a byproduct of how they operate. Their distance creates the gap, and their moments of intensity fill it so dramatically that it distorts perception. And once someone experiences that cycle absence followed by powerful presence, it becomes incredibly hard to see it clearly. Because the memory of the intensity keeps rewriting the reality of everything else. You don't remember the inconsistency the same way. You remember how it felt when everything suddenly came alive. And that feeling convinces you that it must have meant something deeper than it actually did. The push-pull dynamic doesn't just create attraction, it rewires how you experience it. One moment there's distance, silence, emotional unavailability. You feel unsure, maybe even disconnected. Then suddenly, without warning, everything flips. Attention returns. Intensity rises. You feel seen again, wanted again, pulled back into something that feels powerful and real. That shift isn't neutral. It hits your nervous system in a way that creates a pattern your brain starts to chase. Because the human mind isn't wired for steady appreciation, it's wired for reward after uncertainty. When something is consistently available, your brain adapts to it. It becomes familiar, predictable, even expected. But when something is inconsistent, when it disappears and then reappears, it creates anticipation. It keeps you mentally engaged, trying to figure out when the next moment of connection will arrive. And when it finally does, it feels amplified not because it's deeper, but because it follows absence. This is the core of the push-pull effect. Avoidants often don't maintain steady emotional presence. They withdraw to protect themselves, to regain control, or to avoid feeling overwhelmed. Then, when the distance feels safe enough, or when the connection starts to slip away, they move closer again. Not always consciously, but consistently enough to create a cycle. And that cycle conditions you. You begin to associate the return of their attention with relief, with validation, with emotional reward. So instead of evaluating the connection based on stability or consistency, your mind starts focusing on the highs, the moments when everything feels intense and aligned. Over time, this creates a subtle shift. You stop asking, is this healthy? And start asking, when will they come back? That's where attraction turns into attachment. Because you're no longer grounded in what's actually happening, you're responding to the pattern. The unpredictability keeps you alert. The intensity keeps you invested, and the contrast between the two keeps you emotionally hooked. This is the same mechanism behind addictive behavior. Not because the experience itself is always good, but because the reward is inconsistent. Your brain releases more dopamine when a reward is uncertain than when it's guaranteed. That uncertainty makes the experience feel more valuable, more exciting, more worth pursuing. So even when the lows feel confusing or draining, they don't push you away the way they should. Instead, they set the stage for the next high. And when that high arrives, it feels even stronger because you've been waiting for it. That's not emotional security.
That's conditioning.
And the most challenging part is that it doesn't feel like something negative.
It feels like passion, like chemistry.
Like a connection that's alive and dynamic. But underneath it, there's a lack of stability that prevents anything real from forming. Because real connection doesn't rely on contrast to feel meaningful. It doesn't need distance to create value. It grows through consistency, through presence that doesn't disappear when things get uncomfortable. The push-pull dynamic replaces that with a cycle that keeps you engaged but never fully grounded. It gives you just enough to stay, but never enough to feel secure. And that's why it creates attachment that feels intense but isn't built on something solid. At first, it feels like you've discovered something most people never get to experience. The intensity, the chemistry, the moments where everything feels alive and electric, it creates the belief that you're part of something rare. You tell yourself that this kind of connection doesn't come often, that it must mean something deeper, something worth holding on to. And for a while, that belief carries you. But what most people aren't prepared for is what comes after the intensity. Because with avoidance, those powerful moments are often followed by something completely different: distance that feels cold, silence that feels confusing, and an emotional absence that doesn't match what you just experienced. It's not just that they pull away, it's how suddenly it happens. One moment they're fully present, fully engaged, almost overwhelming in their energy. The next, it's like they've disappeared behind a wall you can't reach through. And that shift is what most people can't handle. Not because they're weak, but because it creates a psychological conflict that's incredibly hard to process. Your mind tries to make sense of two completely opposite experiences coming from the same person. You've seen their intensity. You felt their presence. So when they become distant, your instinct isn't to walk away, it's to understand what changed. You start questioning yourself. Did I do something wrong? Did I misread the connection? Why can they be so close one moment and so far the next? That search for answers keeps you emotionally engaged, even when the connection itself isn't stable. You're no longer just experiencing the relationship, you're trying to solve it. And while you're doing that, the avoidant has already returned to their default state of control. For them, the intensity was a moment, a release. Once it passes, they go back to what feels safe emotional distance, independence, and minimal vulnerability. There's no urgency on their side to maintain that same level of closeness, because closeness itself can feel overwhelming if it lasts too long. So now you're left holding on to something they've already stepped away from. That's where the emotional strain begins to build, because you're trying to maintain a connection that only fully exists in fragments. You're remembering how it felt at its peak, while experiencing something completely different in the present. And that gap between what was and what is creates frustration, confusion, and eventually, exhaustion. Most people aren't built to function in that kind of inconsistency. Real emotional bonds rely on a sense of continuity, knowing that what you experience today won't completely disappear tomorrow. But with avoidance, that continuity is often missing. What you get instead is unpredictability. And unpredictability erodes stability. You start feeling like you have to adapt constantly, to read between the lines, to adjust your expectations, to accept less just to keep the connection alive. But even then, it never feels fully secure. There's always a part of you waiting for the next shift, the next withdrawal, the next moment where everything changes without explanation. That's why most people eventually reach a breaking point. Not because they didn't care enough, but because they didn't care enough, but because the emotional cost becomes too high. The intensity that once felt exciting starts to feel draining. The connection that once felt powerful starts to feel unstable. And the hardest realization is this: It wasn't that the intensity wasn't real. It's that it wasn't enough to sustain something real over time. At some point, the illusion starts to crack. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, in the moments where you're left alone with your thoughts, wondering why something that feels so powerful can also feel so unstable. That's when the shift begins. You start realizing that what you've been chasing isn't actually giving you what you need. It's giving you moments, intense, unforgettable moments, but not something you can stand on. And that's where everything changes. Because the moment you stop chasing intensity, you start seeing things clearly. Consistency doesn't arrive with fireworks. It doesn't overwhelm your senses or pull you into emotional highs. It shows up in small, steady ways. In someone who responds without making you wait in confusion. In someone who doesn't disappear when things get real. In someone whose presence doesn't fluctuate based on their internal battles. At first, it can even feel unfamiliar, almost underwhelming, because your mind has been conditioned to associate love with intensity. But consistency is where real connection lives. It's in the predictability of someone who chooses you daily, not just in moments of emotional overflow. It's in conversations that don't feel like puzzles you have to solve. It's in the calmness that replaces anxiety, the clarity that replaces confusion. And while it may not give you the same adrenaline rush, it gives you something far more valuable: stability. Presence works the same way. It's not about how intensely someone can show up in a single moment. It's about how reliably they can be there across time. Presence means emotional availability that doesn't vanish when things get uncomfortable. It means you don't have to question where you stand, because their actions remain aligned with their words. It means connection that doesn't depend on timing, mood, or cycles of withdrawal. And once you begin to value that, intensity starts to lose its grip on you, because you realize something important. Intensity without presence creates confusion, but presence without intensity can still create peace. And peace is something most people don't recognize as valuable until they've experienced the opposite for too long. You stop being impressed by how strong something feels in the moment and start paying attention to how it holds up over time. You stop chasing emotional highs and start noticing emotional safety. You begin to understand that love isn't proven by how intense it can get, but by how consistent it remains when there's nothing dramatic happening. This doesn't mean intensity is bad. It has its place. It can bring excitement, passion, and energy into a connection. But without consistency and presence to support it, it becomes unstable. It becomes something that lifts you up quickly, only to drop you just as fast. Real connection doesn't rely on spikes. It builds through continuity. And when you finally internalize that, your standards change. You no longer settle for moments that feel powerful but leave you questioning everything afterward. You start choosing experiences that may feel calmer on the surface, but stronger at the core. Because deep down, what you're really looking for isn't intensity. It's something that stays. In the end, what feels the most powerful isn't always what's the most real. The intensity. You experience the moments that felt electric, the connection that seemed deeper than anything you've known. It all had an impact, no doubt. But impact alone doesn't build something lasting. It creates memories, it creates emotional highs, it creates a story your mind keeps replaying. And that's where most people get stuck, not in the reality of what the connection is, but in the feeling of what it once was. You start holding on to flashes of intensity as proof of depth, even when everything outside those moments tells a different story. And the longer you stay in that space, the more you begin to lose sight of what a real grounded connection is supposed to feel like. Because real connection doesn't come and go like a storm. It doesn't leave you guessing, questioning, or trying to decode someone's behavior. It doesn't rely on extremes to feel meaningful. It builds in a way that's steady, almost quiet at first, but strong enough to last. It's not about how high the highs can get. It's about whether there are lows at all, whether there's stability when nothing exciting is happening. And that's the part most people overlook. They chase intensity because it's loud, because it's immediate, because it makes them feel something powerful. But what they actually need is something consistent, something present, something that doesn't disappear the moment things become real. So the shift isn't about avoiding intensity, it's about no longer being controlled by it. It's about recognizing the difference between something that feels strong and something that is strong. When you stop chasing emotional highs and start valuing emotional safety, everything changes. Your standards rise. Your clarity sharpens. And you begin to choose connections that don't just excite you in the moment, but support you over time. Because at the end of it all, the goal isn't to experience something intense for a short period, it's to build something real that doesn't leave you empty once the intensity fades. Thank you for staying all the way through this journey. If something in these words made you pause, reflect, or see your situation differently, then this moment mattered. Sometimes the biggest shifts don't come from loud realizations, they come from quiet understanding that changes how you move forward. And now, as you step away from this, carry one thing with you. Choose what brings you peace, not just what excites you. Because the life you build and the connections you keep will always reflect what you decide you truly deserve. Goodbye for now, and remember, the strongest moves you'll ever make are often the ones no one else sees.